and I answered publicly.
Sweet. Nobody will know who asked.
Public service announcement, so that makes sense.
Yeah.
Never thought I'd think so hard about my background in my office.
I was just thinking the sun will slowly be setting as this webinar goes on. Hopefully it won't get too dark.
We'll be watching the sunset with you.
Yes, I'll make sure you can focus on that. And
All right, this is a good group. We're looking at 61 attendees so far, 62. And then I'm going to go ahead and get started. I'm going to take advantage of the next minute or two to do some housekeeping, and then we can start with intros. And so as folks have noticed, we have the webinar set up. So we have our 3 panelists. I'll be facilitating today. If you have any questions, if you look at the bottom icons, there's 2 little chat boxes or messages that says Q&A. If you have any questions, please feel free to send them along there. And then I'll be reviewing them, and we'll leave a section towards the end for questions, and our panelists can discuss. And you also have the chat option too. If you want to comment or anything else, feel free to use that. And then, as I mentioned a second ago, we will be recording this webinar, and so we'll be sure to distribute that to those who were able to make it, and also to those who weren't. And I think that's about it for housekeeping. And so I'll introduce myself first. I'm Ramon Valdez. I'm with Innovation Law Lab. I'm currently in Portland, Oregon. And my role today will be simply to facilitate and then to ask questions on behalf of attendees. And then I'll kick it over to our 3 panelists to introduce yourselves. Maybe we can go Ariel, Dr. Zeidan, and then Aliya.
Great. My name's Arielle Prado. I'm the director of the Defend Asylum program through Innovation Law Lab. And through that program, I think most of what we'll be talking today that I focus on is our Defend Asylum clinic, where we work with pro se asylum seekers in hostile jurisdictions, and particularly in Atlanta. Really excited to be on this call. I love working with Aliya. It's been really incredible having you on the team, and super grateful for Dr. Zeidan taking the time and being a part of this. Thank you. I'll pass it to Dr. Zeidan.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. The best part about this is I was able to swap out of the shift. And as you can imagine, a Friday night shift in the ER is pretty wild. So don't get me wrong, I like it, but sometimes I welcome the break. So I am an ER doctor. I work for Emory, but at our hospital, Grady Hospital in Atlanta, which is our county hospital. And on the side, my sort of side hustle is I run a human rights clinic where we focus on forensic evaluations for asylum seekers. I did that back in Philadelphia for many years, and then joined faculty here in July. So we've now probably been in 6 to 7 months operation of our clinic, and we are doing a lot of great work, but there's a lot of work that needs to be done in this state.
Hi, everyone. My name is Aliya Naim. I coordinate the Defend Asylum Workshops in Atlanta, so I work with Ariel to coordinate that program here. Defend Asylum is a program under Innovation Law Lab, and I've been working in that position since October, more broadly with immigrants in Georgia for about 4 years now. And I'm super excited to be on the panel with everyone here, especially with Dr. Zeidan, who's gonna, Zeidan, sorry, I just pronounced it wrong after you.
No, you said it the right way. I said it the assimilated way.
Oh, okay. Well, that's good to know.
Yeah, good job.
Dr. Zeidan, who is, who's gonna talk to us about some really interesting stuff that I did not know before. So I'm really excited.
Thanks, everyone. And as for context about today's agenda and the structure of today's conversation, we're gonna start off. The focus, of course, is asylum, both the principle of asylum and the process and how it impacts and how it plays out in our communities. And so we'll be starting off and providing a little bit of an overview about what asylum is, the process for those who aren't familiar, and then let's see here, and then talk a little bit about how that plays out and what it looks like the mechanics and how that impacts those who are seeking asylum, and then both historically, just generally what that process is like, which is very problematic, dysfunctional, a complete mess, and how it's playing out now under COVID-19, where we're living in a different universe, and how we're watching that when structures collapse, they tend to collapse first on those who are the most vulnerable among us, which are immigrants and refugees. And so it's really helpful, and we really appreciate Dr. Zeidan's time, because I think that it's really, we often talk about this through the lens of the law, but obviously there are many other needs, and so we're really grateful to have that perspective from Dr. Zeidan. So I'll kick it over to Arielle to start the conversation, and then I will let you kick it to each other, and then I'll jump back in at the end for Q&A, and we're gonna try to keep it to 10 minutes per panelist, and then we'll open up the discussion afterwards, just for the sake of efficiency. So Arielle.
Great, thanks, Ramon. For what it's worth, I kind of tweaked some edits on the slideshow, so if you want to give it a go and try presenting it, feel free. But if you haven't had a chance to look at it, people can just stare at my face, that's fine. I want to start with a brief overview of the history of asylum law in the US, so we can really begin to give some concrete meaning to the notion of defending asylum. For the purposes of today, I want to start with the 1951 Geneva Convention, which offered an overly complex, in my opinion, definition of refugee in the aftermath of World War II. The intent of the convention was to prevent governments from forcing people to return to places where they might face persecution. The US didn't sign on to the 1951 convention, but we did ratify the 1967 protocol, which expanded the scope of the Geneva Convention to the entire world. And in doing so, the US committed to upholding the Geneva Convention and the principles of non-refoulement. I think there's so many places to kind of start this conversation, but I think starting here is just a way of really making it clear. And I know so many of us kind of joining this call are already aware, but the things that we're talking about and this idea of defending asylum, while the process itself isn't perfect, it represents international commitments that we've made to protect some of the most vulnerable people in the world, and here in the US. So when I say that we committed to upholding the principles of non-refoulement, specifically what that means, or still in broad terms, but a little more specifically, is that we committed to not send refugees to a place where they might be at risk of persecution, or to a country which might send them to a place where they might be at risk of persecution. That we committed to provide refugees with a legal status in the US, including rights such as access to employment, education, and social security. And that we committed to refrain from punishing refugees for entering the US illegally. And I mean, I did air quotes under the table. I don't know if you could see that, but that we have committed to not punish people for entering the US illegally if they are entering the US to seek asylum. There are tons of examples of the ways that the US has fallen short of its international obligations under the 1951 Convention, but in the past 4 years especially, our asylum system has been repeatedly attacked and dismantled by an unabashedly racist administration. That white supremacist agenda that guides so many of this administration's actions has deep roots. When we talk about asylum seekers in the United States, we're talking about people from all over the world with a diverse range of experiences, but we're predominantly talking about people fleeing persecution in the global South, and there are plenty of shared experiences and common threads. Some I think are especially important to talk about today on International Workers' Day. So when we talk about people seeking asylum in the US, we are nearly always talking about people who are fleeing countries that have been destabilized by European and US imperialist tendencies and practices. I know that the slide that you're looking at is a close-up of, well, close-up, of course it's not a close-up, but as an image of Central America focused on Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras. The majority of the folks that we work with through the Defend Asylum program are from those three countries. But it's important to remember that destabilization and destabilization that the US has been involved in really exists throughout the global South. And I'm going to talk just a little bit about that. So many of the people seeking asylum in the United States are from indigenous communities that have managed to survive colonialism And US imperialism continues to undermine popular movements for worker protections throughout the global South, paving the way for multinational corporations to exploit workers and dominate national economies and political discourse. Destabilized economies force people to move, and the US response to immigration, and especially the immigration of people of color, has been to stigmatize economic migrants as undeserving of the right to move. The continued criminalization of communities of color and working class people in the US has meant that Black and brown immigrants are caught up in the US's racist police systems, which in turn funnel immigrants of color into the deportation machine. And then the mass deportation of young immigrants of color to places where they have little to no ties further destabilizes those countries. I'm moving through all of this way more quickly than it deserves, but we've only got an hour total and I've only got 10 minutes. And so the point that I'd really like to make is that the US has played an active role in developing the conditions that have generated refugee crises throughout the global South. And so I think we really do bear some responsibility for many of the current refugee crises around the world. And what we see is that rather than act from a place of responsibility and generosity, our government continues to exploit asylum seekers from the moment they arrive in the United States. We lock them in detention centers and force them to work for the profit of our taxpayer-funded private prison corporations. If and when they are released, it is difficult to impossible for a person seeking asylum to secure a work permit without legal representation. Obviously, this doesn't mean that people don't work. With barely any safety nets in place for people seeking asylum, folks have to work to survive. What it means instead is that people seeking asylum are hyper vulnerable to exploitation by employers who wield the threat of calling immigration authorities and reporting individuals for working illegally. In Georgia, it comes full circle in a deeply and tragically ironic way. The Stewart Detention Center, which is one of the largest immigrant detention centers in the United States, is less than an hour from WHINSEC, or the Western Hemisphere Institute for Security Cooperation, formerly known as the School of the Americas. The School of the Americas, which has trained military forces throughout Central and South America on how to repress popular movements. So asylum seekers and immigrants are detained, and other immigrants are detained within driving distance, within an hour's driving distance of the institution that helped create the conditions that have displaced thousands throughout Latin America. There's a kind of common refrain, this idea that estamos aquí porque ustedes estuvieron allá, this idea that we are here because you all were there. And I think that that's something that's really important to keep in mind as we're thinking about not just our international obligations under the 1951 Convention, not just the commitments that we've signed on to that say that we will not send people back to the places where they fear persecution, but that we also bear some responsibility for these crises that we have played a significant role as a country in fueling. And dogs coming in to listen. Okay, well, I'm tempted to turn the camera. That's what I do on every Zoom call, but I think there's enough people on this one that I'll refrain. He's really cute, y'all. So I just want to close up with one last piece of legislation, the 1980 Refugee Act. So we signed on to the 1967 protocol, and in 1980, the US, actually, I think it was under Jimmy Carter. But anyways, in 1980, the Refugee Act comes into play, which outlines the process by which refugees and asylum seekers are admitted to the United States. So it begins to establish the process by which asylum claims would be adjudicated. But it left much of that process to the interpretation of the administrative agencies that would administer that system. In the broadest terms, what it does is it puts the burden of proof on each individual who is fleeing persecution and seeking asylum in the US to show that they meet the definition of a refugee. This is, towards the beginning, I said that in my opinion, the definition of a refugee is overly complex, that it involves too much legal language and that it's hard to understand. And I think that's really important, because what it does is it makes the definition of a refugee, which an asylum seeker has to prove that they meet that definition, it makes that concept inaccessible in many ways. It's hard to find reliable data on how many asylum seekers have representation for many reasons, including the fact that often asylum seekers are not recorded in data sets as asylum seekers unless and until they submit a complicated asylum application form. But in 2019, 65% of immigrants in removal proceedings were not represented, and in states with especially hostile jurisdictions, like Georgia, like Texas, that number rises to 80%. And we can expect that number, the number of immigrants in deportation proceedings or in removal proceedings who do not have attorneys, to be even higher for asylum seekers because they're rarely able to afford private representation. So the process that was set forth in the 1980 Refugee Act was already difficult to navigate because it involves this kind of difficult, inaccessible definition of what a refugee is, taken from the 1951 Convention. And now the majority of immigrants are left to navigate that without legal representation. And in recent history, what we've seen is that that process, which already was designed poorly, without kind of, not from the perspective of the people who would be forced to navigate it, has been weaponized to accelerate the mass deportation of immigrants of color. So that's kind of the dark, very quick picture that I wanted to draw for y'all. Sorry not to inject it with very much hope, but I'm going to pass it to my coworker Aliya, who I think is part of my inspiration for kind of feeling any hope in this work. I'm so grateful to work with her, to work on our team, or on her team, and I'm really excited for her to share about her work. So with that, I will mute myself and pass it on over. Thank you.
Unmute myself. Thank you so much. Also love working on Ariel's team, and that was a great introduction to this. I hope I can, maybe there's some more positivity I can inject into it, but unfortunately we're talking about things that are not in a great state right now. So apologies for that in advance. But I want to start out talking a little bit about this idea of the illusion of safety, right? So I think that when people leave maybe their home country fleeing persecution, and there's this idea that once you arrive at the US border, you've arrived at a place of safety, where if you think about what you would want in that situation, right, you would want a place where you have the ability, the time, the bandwidth to heal from trauma, to help your children thrive in a new home, to find dignified employment, to support yourself and your family. But unfortunately, over the past 6 years, that illusion has been shattered many, many times over, as those who are seeking safety from persecution and from violence arrive at the border, and instead of finding that place of safety, become subject to the manufactured chaos that defines the immigration enforcement apparatus in the United States. So folks fleeing persecution who come to the US to seek safety, up until very recently, were greeted in one of three ways. They were unlawfully returned to Mexico. These are people coming up through the southern border. They were unlawfully returned to Mexico under what's called Trump's Migrant Protection Protocols Program, or MPP, also known as Remain in Mexico. The second option is that they were detained, sometimes for the duration of their asylum case, or in some cases they were paroled and granted bond and released. So that means that they're not detained, they're free to move where they want to in the US, but they do have to go to these frequent check-ins with immigration enforcement. And I say up until recently because Trump, as many of you all may know, Trump has used COVID-19 as an excuse to shut down the border for asylum seekers altogether and to ban all immigration into the United States. But before that, families were separated along these three different tracks, and often the folks that we work with here in Atlanta have family members who maybe are still detained, who were never released, who've been subject to MPP, to remain in Mexico, and are stranded in Mexico, or who were able to enter the United States, but for whatever reason were summarily deported back to their country of origin. So when an asylum seeker arrives at their destination, for simplicity's sake, let's talk about asylum seekers who are not detained, who are released, right? An asylum seeker who arrives at their destination, whether it be Georgia, Oregon, New York, Texas, they find themselves completely alone with regards to navigating their legal obligations and the next steps they have to take to formally seek asylum. Unlike in criminal proceedings where you have the right to an attorney, the government is not obligated to provide an attorney to provide legal counsel to these asylum seekers or these immigrants. So they have to navigate this English language process on a very tight, compressed timeline. And they're in that process, on that tight timeline, there's also these numerous legal pitfalls and points of possible failure where a small administrative mistake, say that your address wasn't changed with the court, for example, can mean that you receive an order of deportation. And no work authorization, the issue that Ariel mentioned in his section, means that most of the time people don't have the money to hire an attorney. And to complicate that, even with the funds to hire an attorney, there's simply not enough attorneys to represent all asylum seekers. Asylum cases take a really long time, both in terms of just the procedures take a long time, and they take a long time to prepare. And so that problem is compounded in hostile jurisdictions like Atlanta with very low acceptance rates, where attorneys rightfully maybe don't want to charge an asylum seeker for a case that they know they're not going to win. And all of this is on top of the challenges that face all vulnerable people, regardless of immigration status in this country. So lack of protections for tenants, for workers, lack of access to transportation, food security, etc. So it's a really difficult situation that people fleeing trauma and fleeing violence are walking into. And so this is where the asylum workshops that we organize here in the Defend Asylum program in Atlanta, this is where they come in. So since hiring an attorney is often impossible or impractical, people are then, if they want to go ahead with seeking asylum, they have no choice but to navigate themselves through that process. In Atlanta, like many other places in the country, the immigration courts tend to be very hostile, like I mentioned, to asylum seekers and have very low rates of approval. And so in the workshops, we're in that position, we're put in the position of sharing that really difficult truth with people from the beginning, that they should not expect to win their case in Atlanta. And that's really depressing, obviously. We tell people this, first of all, ethically, to not sugarcoat the situation, but then also to create a space where people understand, where these folks seeking asylum understand that if or when they lose at their evidentiary hearing where they're presenting their case, it's not because they themselves as individuals fell short or that their case isn't strong enough, but that everyone in the room at the workshop, from the weakest case to the very strongest, most watertight case, is collectively in the same situation. And that opens up the possibility that maybe if the problem is collective, then the solution also must be collective. But the main goal of these asylum workshops are, they're an attempt to guide people through the process. So on a monthly basis, a cohort of volunteer attorneys, advocates, community members, bilingual volunteers work with individuals to help them cross those. I said that there was this compressed timeline of these pitfalls. And the purpose of each workshop is to help people cross each pitfall as it comes closer. So filing applications before their deadline, getting updated information on their court hearing information, filing for work permits once they're eligible for those, etc. To avoid the harm of receiving a deportation order without ever getting the chance to present your case in front of a judge. So that's what our workshops have been. They have been complicated recently. They've become complicated due to the sort of chaotic situation that we all find ourselves in due to COVID-19. So I'm the workshop coordinator in Atlanta. I'm usually the person who's in contact with our participants. And in the past month and a half, 2 months, I've received many, many calls and texts about just widespread suffering, right? That the person speaking to me, that they or their financial supporter is out of work, maybe stuck in their house with no food for their kids, threatened with eviction, unable to pay rent, and then on top of that, that many people in the country may be suffering, having to navigate this completely inscrutable to non-existent guidance from ICE, from immigration courts about how to proceed with their cases, if they should be showing up for their appointments and their hearings. And then underlying all of this, of course, is the fear of contracting COVID-19 and what will happen to them and what will happen to their families if they do become sick. And as we all know, people who are undocumented in this country and who are most vulnerable are the ones falling through the cracks and not being allowed to benefit from the inadequate, in the first place, emergency social protections that have come out in recent weeks. And And I want to point out that the folks that we work with in Atlanta are coming, until recently, have been coming physically to workshops. But many, many of them have family members, loved ones, friends that are still detained. And many of these people will often be detained for months to years. And I think a lot of focus in recent years has rightfully, been placed with these really shocking images we've seen of family separation, kids in cages, et cetera, at the border. But it's important to recognize that painful, prolonged family separation exists throughout the country, and not just when you cross the border. It exists when parents and or breadwinners are separated from their families on a daily and sometimes permanent basis. So then that legal situation for the family becomes even more fraught and even more complicated. And so many of these folks who are detained are forced to navigate the entire process that's already really difficult, really kind of hopeless, from a detention cell with very little access to legal assistance or any other kind of assistance. And then now they're in this heightened period of danger because of the pandemic and because of the danger that that exists for people who are in these really cramped detention facilities. And so that's kind of my summary of what we do at the workshops. I'm sure we'll get to talk more about it in the Q&A, but I am really excited to pass it on to Dr. Zeidan now, who will talk to us about why people in detention are especially vulnerable to COVID-19 and really what actions need to be taken for that to be mitigated. So yeah, passing it now.
Thank you. So we could also, looks like we're going to have some good questions. We could also skip my section if you want. Just kidding. Ariel, there's a request to see your dog. So if they come in during my time, please feel free to show your dog. So I want to just step back for a second and say, how did I even get started or interested in work specific to asylum seekers? And what I hope to provide is a bit of a medical perspective. So as an emergency medicine physician, we tend to see people who don't have insurance or don't have another place to go, another clinic that serves them. And so what I find is that we see a lot of, sort of unknowingly, we see a lot of asylum seekers and immigrants in the emergency department. And so part of my hope is to improve care for those in the emergency department and their care access and options outside of the emergency department. But also the separate sort of component is that individuals who apply for asylum, if they do have legal representation, sometimes if they don't, but if they do, their lawyer in theory can ask for a medical forensic evaluation, which is a physical or psychological evaluation to document a history of trauma and torture. So what that means is, as a physician, I will then do a physical exam and a psychological exam to show and demonstrate evidence of physical or psychological torture, which for some people is the only evidence that they have. And so there have been some estimates that cases are 2 to 3 times more likely to be granted asylum if they have a medical forensic evaluation, a medical or psych forensic evaluation accompanying their case. And so that's sort of how asylum clinics and physicians, clinicians can help in the United States. There's an organization called Physicians for Human Rights that organizes and coordinates a lot of medical school affiliated asylum clinics, which is sort of how I learned about this and helped work at one back in Philadelphia and now here. So what we do is try to help in that capacity to strengthen an individual's case. But what I'm going to talk a little bit more about is, and I can answer any other questions related to COVID and healthcare specifically for refugees and immigrants during the Q&A. But what I wanted to focus on is sort of what the situation is in detention centers. And so detention centers are really primed for a COVID outbreak. So for someone like me as an ER physician who is dealing with COVID on a daily basis, that idea is terrifying because an outbreak, we can't handle, our healthcare system can't really handle an outbreak in a big facility like that. And when I say that the facilities are primed, what I mean is that the option for social distancing is really limited. Staying 6 feet apart from anybody is incredibly limited. The option for appropriate sanitation is really limited. And the option for appropriate barriers in protective equipment is really limited, both for those who live there and those who work there. And so if healthcare workers are having a hard time getting access to appropriate protective equipment, I can't imagine how it is in a facility where people in theory are very vulnerable in a different way. So there's a lot of sort of priming, I think, that detention facilities support in how physically close people are and the limited options for sanitation and appropriate protective equipment. The other thing is, obviously, we've heard a lot about testing, both worldwide and nationwide. And while we have really scaled up our testing, that is really not the case. And if you think about who gets tested, it tends to be the most vulnerable society who are tested last. And so, you know, we as hospitals have a bit better access to testing capabilities than would a detention facility. And truly, truly, if you want a functional cure, what you would have to do is you would have to test every person in detention right now, and then every person that goes in and out of the facility every single day. And so that's the only way you could really, truly accurately understand the incidents and protect people appropriately. The other component that's quite concerning is that a lot of facilities, their reaction to individuals who have medical problems is something called medical isolation, which means the detained individual is placed sort of separately, which, you know, in theory seems like the right thing, but a lot of times this essentially is equivalent to solitary confinement. And so with how serious the disease is and how rapidly it can progress, what that means is if somebody's isolated, doesn't have appropriate monitoring, doesn't have somebody checking on them, they can become very sick very fast. And I mean, not to mention all the other terribly demoralizing things that come with being isolated in that setting. So it's something else to sort of think about, like not only just how are they preparing, but what are the actual actions in place for those who do test positive and are sick. The other important consideration is that in Georgia, we have, I think, some of the highest number of detainees compared to other states. And I personally feel that we get less attention as a state because we're not a border state. And so we sort of fly under the radar, and we don't have as many, we have a lot of really incredible advocates in the city, but we are also more of a conservative state. And so that interplay is really interesting and challenging. And so what that means is when I helped with cases in Pennsylvania, for example, our asylum grant rate was 50 to 60%. So most cases that I helped with, it was positive news, and that's not the case here. So not only do we have abysmal grant rates, but we have terribly high numbers of detained immigrants in really abysmal detention facilities. The concerning thing about the detention facilities is that many of them are located in very rural areas. And so the hospitals that are closest to the detention facilities simply don't have the resources to take care of a lot of people or those who are critically ill. So for example, Stewart Detention Center is about an hour to 2 away from a tertiary care center that has an intensive care unit that could appropriately care for multiple people, meaning more than 3, 4, or 5 in an intensive care unit. Whereas they do have a critical access hospital that's about 30 minutes away, but a critical access hospital is really meant to stabilize people and send them to a higher level of care if needed. And so it's just not fair for that hospital and for the patients that we would expect them to care for a large number of individuals if an outbreak were to happen. And we did sort of see that with Phoebe Putney, if anybody sort of remembers that from a week ago. They were overwhelmed with a large number of cases, and it overwhelmed their healthcare system. So we also have to think about the specific barriers in a lot of rural communities and the healthcare facilities that exist there, and how those two things would necessarily not go hand in hand. I'm just looking at my notes to see if there's any other important points. I think with that, that's sort of, I'll stop there, and then I'm happy to answer any other COVID-related questions. And I would say I can talk more about this later, but the other thing and that's really important, is that much of our information about coronavirus is in English in a way that we understand it. And so trying to get information into a detention facility alone is really challenging, but trying to get appropriate information into a detention facility is really even more challenging. So most people, are not hearing about it. Most individuals who are detained are not really hearing about what coronavirus is in a way that's factual. And so many people are really terrified just because they simply don't know. They don't have answers to many questions, and they don't have resources that are appropriate for them in their own language. And so that really does, if it were me and I didn't understand something obviously this severe, it's terrifying. And so thinking about too how we inform our communities where a lot of our asylum seekers, whether detained or not, exist is so important.
Thank you so much to you three. And so we have some really good questions here. Before I start picking questions, I want to open it up to the panelists in case there are other comments before we switch to Q&A. And if not, the question that I'd actually like to start with, just to make sure that we have enough time, because it's come up in previous webinars, is, it's a really scary moment collectively for so many reasons for all of us, right? And one of the things that we're realizing with COVID-19 is that we're all, like, our well-being is very closely connected to the well-being of others, and the way that the system has been set up for both asylum, immigration in general, and then especially detention, is extremely problematic in a situation like this one. And so I think with all of us being social distance, we're all kind of feeling very siloed. We can't get out and protest because of social distancing. So the question being to you three, what can folks do to advocate for a better system, or for solutions, or for whatever that the call to action should be? What should folks do?
I'm happy to start, and then if folks want to jump in and tackle whatever I miss. I think, number one, just on the idea that we can't get out there and protest, I think this is a moment that kind of calls for creativity. I think that there are ways to get out there and protest that, and we're seeing a lot of, actually just today there was the caravan in Atlanta, in downtown Atlanta, of folks in their cars. And so people put banners on their cars and they drive around, and and that becomes like a new way of pushing these messages out into the public sphere. And so I think it's exciting to see people politically engaging in that way. But one of the other things that there are just so many other ways to kind of engage politically. And so getting out into public and really kind of shouting our messages from the rooftops is one thing, but the other is making sure that we're calling our congresspeople, making sure that we're calling our public officials on a regular basis and holding them accountable for, at the very least, coming out with a statement in favor of, one thing that we're calling for here in Georgia. We have yet to get a response from Governor Kemp or from the Georgia Department of Public Health, but it's for the Georgia Department of Public Health to at least begin to negotiate with ICE to release people from detention centers. I think it goes back to what Dr. Zeidan was saying about rural hospitals being, the detention centers are primed to overwhelm rural hospitals when there's a COVID-19 outbreak. And that's something that the Georgia Department of Public Health needs to be paying attention to. And so I think calling our elected officials, writing our elected officials, and kind of raising these issues for them is one kind of really important first step. I don't know if others have other thoughts on this.
I'll jump in. I think that the power of calling cannot be understated. And I shared sort of beforehand a story about an individual with really significant medical problems who is detained at one of the detention centers in Georgia a few months back. And she was very obviously unlucky, but very lucky in that she had a very motivated family who highly mobilized, meaning they essentially turned an entire university into a call center. And so with that number of calls, it actually did result in action, to the point where when I would call, the the voice on the other end was like, yeah, we know, we're doing something, you know. So I do think that can't be understated. I think writing about it is really important. I wrote an op-ed about it that I thought was really therapeutic for me, but also really important to put in front of lawmakers and put in front of the public, so that people sort of know how bad it is. Because I think sometimes it's lack of awareness or denial or disbelief as well. And so really putting it in front of people and explaining what's going on and how certain changes are possible in terms of releasing specific individuals. I mean, hopefully all, but if not all, specific individuals with high risk conditions.
And another thing that I'd add to that as well, and apologies if this has been mentioned, but I think it's a really important piece of it. It's important to remember that this population is also out of work, wasn't included in the CARES Act, didn't receive a stimulus check. You know, it's May 1st today, this is the second rent that is passed while many people have been out of work. And so the economic downturn it just exacerbates a lot of the problems that these families were already experiencing, especially, you know, those with loved ones who are detained, who might need to pay a bond or need to pay for an attorney for them to get out in the first place, and then hire another attorney to apply for asylum. And so another call to action that has been going around that I think is really important is to look for worker relief funds in your community and support those, especially if you're in a situation where you're not out of work and possibly received a stimulus check. Maybe donating a portion of your check or potentially all of it, if you're willing to do that, that will go a long way in balancing that inequality yeah. And so there's one question that I see coming up a lot, and so I'm going to ask this. This is towards especially Ariel and Aliya, if you could elaborate on the Pro Se Asylum program. And then I think there's a few different iterations of that. And how it's pivoting under COVID-19, like what that infrastructure, what those mechanics look like.
Yeah, sure. I can definitely speak to that. So, and you know, in March, when that call to start social distancing and limiting large groups of people came, I think we talked about it, and we came to the decision that it would not be very responsible to keep holding these workshops in a physical space where people have to gather. But unfortunately, people's one-year filing deadlines have not changed. Some people will have court dates. You know, the courts have been closing or postponing incrementally their hearings, but you know, people will have court dates coming up when the courts stop postponing hearings. And so we did have to pivot kind of quickly. We decided to basically organize remote workshops. So what that means is we still, in some ways, they were very much the same. We had the same teams of people working. We're inviting the same participants we would have invited in April that we would have invited to a physical workshop. But we said, you don't have to go anywhere. Just be ready to answer a phone call in the morning. And we have such a great, because we've been working in Atlanta since January of 2019, more or less, we're lucky to have a really great, very dedicated group of volunteers, both attorneys, non-attorneys, bilingual members of the community that we were able to kind of gather. We figured out like the Zoom logistics and the phone logistics and the tech piece, and we're able to train people to do these remote interviews, remote consultations, and to hold the workshop online. So we did the first one back in early April, and we intend to do another one pretty soon, next weekend actually. And so there's it's really interesting because there's some positives and some negatives to it. We've actually seen that maybe this remote situation increases access in some ways, and that people don't have to find transportation, don't have to physically, go to a place. But unfortunately, it does. It is not ideal in the sense that a lot of the times people are sharing. I mean, we have to keep in mind when we're talking about an asylum application, there's these like dry biographical facts to share, but then there's also the fact that people are already being forced to recount a lot of trauma, you know, the worst, most frightening, sometimes most violent or humiliating experiences of their life. And it's really not great that they have to do that in the first place, even to an attorney, let alone to a volunteer, and then let alone to a volunteer over the phone. So, you know, it's I think a complicated sort of topic, but we were able to switch to remote for now, and we'll see how that goes as the situation progresses.
Can I add two things? I think one of the things that I really love about the workshops is that we take more we take all of the referrals in, and then we triage the referrals. So we don't pay, like, we're not looking to see whether someone has a strong case or a weak case or anything like that. And I think that goes back to what Ali was saying earlier. We know that everybody's going to lose in the Atlanta Immigration Court. And so the difference between losing for a technical reason or a procedural reason in the short term and learning how to navigate the system and being empowered to kind of safeguard one's right to an evidentiary hearing, to a merits hearing, and then to appeal the immigration judge's decision is kind of the difference that the workshops are trying to leverage. And so what we do for the workshops is we take the referrals and then we'll sort them based on who has the most urgent case timeline. And those are the folks that we invite to participate. The second thing I wanted to add is one of the potential benefits that we've kind of identified but haven't acted on, because we have a relatively strong, dedicated, we have a very dedicated, relatively large group of volunteers here in Atlanta. But one of the possibilities that we've identified is that because we're doing the workshops remotely, we could actually be working with volunteers anywhere in the US. So if there's anyone on this call who is bilingual, who speaks English and Spanish or English and another language and might be interested in volunteering through the workshops, please reach out. And we would love to be in touch.
Can I add one thing to a separate question? But when we were talking about sort of a call to action, there was a good comment about what can we do? Let me find it. Group of non-lawyer volunteers are being trained to support attorneys in filing cases. So that is another good, great option. I've helped write some declarations for some of our local organizations. Southern Poverty Law Center does amazing work here. And so in partnership with them, we've done a few things that I think non-lawyer volunteers can do. This one is probably challenging, but I would say any clinician could do it, where we write letters for individuals who are detained to simply just get bond or parole. And so what we do is review their case, and there's some sort of standard language you can use with COVID based on specific comorbidities and risk factors, age being one of them, to try to support and provide evidence and provide support that an individual that is at high risk. And so those medical letters have helped. Also, the declarations have helped. What really helps, and I don't know how they organize this necessarily, but there were certain things that I was like, you know, rural areas are terrible because the hospitals don't have the capacity. So someone, one of the volunteers was able to, I don't know how they found this data, they're like amazing, amazing ability to find things on the internet. But they found every single hospital in Georgia and their ICU capacity, and in theory, their ventilator, the number of ventilators they had. So I think there's a lot of things that can help in informing those questions about like really good data that, you know, I knew that it needed to be done, but I didn't necessarily have the best way to do it, or also the time at that portion, since I'm obviously working full time still. So it just was really helpful. I don't know the best way to do that, but my guess is many of the local legal organizations have ways to help delegate.
There's one question in here too that I'd like to add, just so to expand on one thing that came up earlier to you, Dr. Zeidan. You mentioned doing mental health evaluations or evaluations for those who were victims of torture. And I'm wondering if you could expand on that and talk a little bit more about what those are and how they fit into the process more broadly.
Sure, sure. So there's the physical evaluation and the psychological evaluation, and most people will have positive psychological findings, right? Like if you've experienced trauma or torture, you will probably, answer specific questions that would screen you in or help support a diagnosis of depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder. So, there's some standard testing that we do for common psychological sequelae after trauma or torture, one being PTSD testing or screening, and depression and anxiety. Now, I should say that those, a lot of our tests and a lot of the things that we normally use in our clinical practice don't necessarily apply the same to individuals who come from a different culture, don't speak the same language, and have very different types of trauma. Gang violence obviously is a huge one. That being said, most people have some form of PTSD. The severity can differ, and it usually leads to specific problems. It could be that person now has a substance use disorder, or that person now has terrible anxiety that they can't even go out of their home. They can't get a job because they are so afraid that they can't go out of their home. They can't form relationships with other people because they're, so distrusting of other people. So those are obviously very common psychological sequelae, and that can, not only support the story, but the support why return to that country would be detrimental to somebody's mental health. But also, a lot of individuals who experience trauma and torture and then are detained have to relive that on a daily basis of, especially if someone was ever imprisoned or had a similar type detention setting. Being in a detention facility means that they're every single day they have those triggers. Somebody said the door that shuts in my room is very similar to the door that I was in when I was imprisoned and tortured. So there's a lot of the findings. And then I promise I'll wrap up. For physical findings, it can be highly variable depending on the type of torture mechanism that was experienced. For some IPV or domestic violence cases, it's obviously sort of a wide array of things, whether that's sexual trauma and ongoing symptoms as a result of that, difficulties with childbirth, urinary tract infections, pain, fistula formation, etc. And then, the torture mechanisms that people do are just terrible. A lot of it involves suspension or forced positioning. So we see a lot of musculoskeletal injuries from that, a lot of traumatic brain injury from repeated blows to the head, and then a lot of scars, especially defensive scars, where people commonly cover their head so they're not, so they're protecting their head. Those are sort of the common things that we find.
Thank you very much, Dr. Zeidan. And I think this might be our last question. And this one came through the chat box, and I wanted to make sure that we got to it. You mentioned before that one idea behind workshops is that people find a way to visualize asylum as a collective solution. What has been the response from the asylum seekers? What are some possibilities and limitations for them to fight together? How does Law Lab see its role in these collective efforts? So feel free to pick and choose any of those three questions. And maybe we can end on that note, and then I'll have some next steps. We'll be sending out some other resources. But
Sure. Aliya, I'm happy to start unless you have an answer on the tip of your tongue. I think it's a really challenging question. So we started, it was kind of one of the potentials that we identified in the workshops as we started. And in the first year, we started in January of 2019. In the first year, we really focused on getting the legal service provision model up and running, with kind of this intent behind the workshops to facilitate this kind of larger conversation. So throughout that first year, we really have had the conversation over and over and over again about how the folks in the room are in this shared struggle or in this collective struggle or kind of whatever that adjective is, but in a struggle together. And what's very difficult is to transition from that recognition to the notion of a collective solution. I wouldn't say that we have done that successfully yet. I think what we're finding is that there are plenty of folks who show up and are just showing up because their backs are against the wall. They need a legal service. We can offer that legal service, and it buys them time. And so we do think of kind of how how families can kind of support themselves and build safety plans by buying time as a form of organizing. That we're kind of buying people time through the workshops, people buy time, which allows them in turn to find work, save money, and plan for an eventual removal order. There are other folks who are a little bit more interested in in accompanying one another to master calendar hearings, in carpooling and kind of finding smaller kind of accessible ways of supporting one another. But we haven't, I don't think, gotten to a point where we're talking about kind of a larger political vision. Definitely still a work in progress, and something that we're kind of reaching outwards for support and thinking through.
Great, thank you so much, Ariel. We're at a minute, and so for everyone in attendance, I'll be sending out an email with a couple of tools, including like we have a script so that you can call your congresspeople. I totally recognize that that's absolutely cliche, and that's the thing that people always tell you to do. But I was on a congressional call earlier. I promise you, it does make a difference for them to feel that pressure, especially in the midst of COVID, where there are so many budgets are getting cut left and right. And so just making sure that we're applying that pressure to make sure that this remains a priority is extremely important and does impact. And so including a script for that, and also a letter that you can send, a template for a letter that you can sell to your local government as well, and among other things that you can do. And so I just want to thank you, Ariel, thank you, Dr. Zeidan, thank you, Aliya, for joining for this really depressing at moments, but it's important that we all be aware of the landscape that we're in, so that we can push forward towards a system that's better. So I'll stop talking there, leave it up for last comments from the panel, and then we'll wrap up. That's it.
Thank you for having me. It's an honor to be here.
Yeah, right. Thanks for joining us, and thanks, Ramon.
Happy Friday, everyone.
Yeah, thank you for
Friday.
participating. Really nice to talk to everyone.